What I am concerned about is the Washington war machine doing what it is.
You say that's Lindsey Graham.
I take that as Senator Graham, the senior senator from South Carolina. I take that as the military-industrial complex. I take that as a guy that is going back to my home state of South Carolina, telling mothers and fathers to send their children into war to take an island over oil. And I am vehemently opposed to that.
I want to play, so everyone's on the same page, hearing what you're talking about in reference to Senator Lindsey Graham, what he had to say. Let me play that.
So here's what I tell President Trump. Keep it up for a few more weeks. Take Carg Island, where all of the resources they have to produce oil. Control that island. Let this regime die on a vine. We got 2 Marine expeditionary units sailing to this island. We did Iwo Jima. We can do this.
Hey guys, welcome. Adam is here. So what just happened, guys? The partisan shield that protected Trump through 2 impeachments and every investigation just cracked. Not from a Democrat, but from a Republican congresswoman who built her entire career on MAGA loyalty. Nancy Mace put it in an official congressional letter. Bondi handled the Epstein files terribly and undermined Trump.
New tonight, the Justice Department said that Pam Bondi won't testify in the Jeffrey Epstein probe since she's no longer serving as Attorney General. Bondi was scheduled to appear for a deposition on April 14th before the House Oversight Committee to discuss her handling of the Epstein files. The DOJ says that since Bondi was subpoenaed in her official role as then Attorney General, the subpoena no longer applies. It's now asking that the subpoena be withdrawn. A spokesperson for the Republican-led House panel says it will contact Bondi about next steps.
When a sworn ally commits that to permanent record, every Democratic accusation stops being a partisan attack and starts being a bipartisan conclusion. That's the crack that doesn't seal back up. And here's where this story transforms from alarming to genuinely terrifying for anyone inside the Trump orbit.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee issue a subpoena to the Honorable Pamela Jo Bondi to appear before the committee for a deposition regarding the department's handling of the investigation into Jeffrey Epstein and his associates and compliance with the Epstein Files Transparency Act.
A motion has been made. The committee will hold this motion in abeyance until the end of today's hearing. The committee will now proceed with today's hearing.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee issue a subpoena to the Office of Congressional Workplace Rights for the awards and settlements paid pursuant to Section 415 of the Congressional Accountability Act prior to December 12, 2018, with only redactions allowable for the personally identifiable information of victims, alleged victims, and witnesses. Thank you, ma'am.
The House Oversight Committee isn't playing games anymore. They've issued a subpoena requiring Bondi to appear for a deposition, not a friendly chat, not a voluntary interview where she can control the narrative. A legally binding subpoena with a hard deadline and real consequences for non-compliance. The Department of Justice, in what can only be described as an act of institutional desperation, has claimed that Bondi no longer serves as Attorney General and therefore won't appear.
Former Attorney General Pam Bondi was supposed to appear before the House Oversight Committee next week, but the Justice Department now says she will not. The department argues that because Bondi was subpoenaed in her official capacity as Attorney General, the subpoena no longer applies. President Trump fired Bondi last week. Lawmakers on both sides say they still expect her to sit for the deposition. Republican Nancy Mace says Bondi cannot escape accountability by leaving office. Democrat Robert Garcia says he will push for contempt charges if she refuses to appear. The fight centers on Bondi's role in releasing the so-called Epstein files, which lawmakers say contained multiple errors and missed a release deadline set by Congress. The committee is also pressing ahead with other witnesses. Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates is set for a closed-door interview on June 10th. Gates has denied any knowledge of Epstein's crimes and says he's willing to cooperate. He has called his meetings and dealings with Epstein a huge mistake.
But the committee's response is the kind of legal checkmate that keeps White House counsel awake at night. They've insisted that the subpoena binds her personally, not in her official capacity. Translation: leaving your job doesn't mean leaving your legal obligations behind. You can't resign your way out of congressional accountability. The subpoena follows the person, not the position.
Now, a committee spokesperson, Congresswoman, had told CNN just last night that the chairman, the plan after the news, was that the chairman was going to speak with members about the status of the deposition subpoena and confer on next steps. Have you talked to the chairman yet about those next steps?
I have not yet, but I made my point very clear yesterday when I issued the subpoena that was voted on by the Oversight Committee a number of weeks ago. We did it by name and not by the title of the Attorney General. So she's still compelled and required by law to come before the Oversight Committee. And
This distinction matters more than anything else in this entire saga because it establishes a precedent that sends ice water through the veins of every former Trump official who thought they could escape scrutiny by simply walking out the door. Personal liability surviving official departure means there's no escape hatch, no golden parachute that also functions as an accountability shield. When Congress wants answers about what happened inside the Department of Justice regarding the Epstein files, they're not asking the institution, they're asking the individual who made the decisions. And that individual cannot hide behind the former official designation, like it's some kind of legal invisibility cloak. Now let's talk about what actually happened during that February hearing because this context transforms everything that followed. Bondi appeared before Congress, and instead of projecting the calm competence you'd expect from the nation's chief law enforcement officer, she melted down in spectacular fashion. We're talking about yelling at lawmakers, actual shouting during official congressional testimony. We're talking about visible sulking, the kind of body language that signals someone who knows they're cornered and has no viable exit strategy. And here's where it gets truly surreal. While Bondi was imploding on national television, while she was providing endless fodder for every late-night host and political commentator in the country, the president was watching, and instead of recognizing a disaster unfolding in real time, instead of understanding that his attorney general was becoming a liability that would eventually consume his own political standing, he called her performance fantastic. Fantastic versus the radical left. Those were his exact words. The President of the United States looked at an Attorney General yelling at members of Congress and decided that was the performance worth celebrating. You cannot make this up. You cannot invent a more damning illustration of how completely disconnected from institutional reality this entire operation has become. The President praised behavior that any first-year law student would recognize as contemptuous. He celebrated conduct that any competent political advisor would identify as self-destructive. And now, months later, that same Attorney General faces a personal subpoena, a Republican defection letter, and a bipartisan congressional demand for accountability. The chickens aren't just coming home to roost, they've organized into a formal congressional inquiry with subpoena power. Let's drill down into the specific architecture of this accountability convergence because understanding the mechanics reveals why this situation is fundamentally different from every other Trump-era controversy. First, you have the fired Attorney General now facing a personal subpoena dimension. The timing alone creates a dramatic tension that no political consultant could have scripted. Bondi gets removed from her position, and before the ink on her termination paperwork can even dry, she's served with a congressional subpoena that specifically names her as an individual rather than as a former official. This sequence, firing immediately followed by personal subpoena enforcement, eliminates every procedural defense that usually protects former administration officials. She can't claim executive privilege in the same way. She can't argue that her testimony would compromise ongoing departmental operations because she's no longer running the department. She's just a private citizen who happens to possess information that Congress has determined is essential to their oversight function. The contempt threat dimension adds another layer of institutional seriousness that separates this from political theater. Bipartisan lawmakers, and let me emphasize how rare genuine bipartisanship has become in this Congress, have specifically demanded compliance or contempt charges. This isn't one-party grandstanding while the other party runs interference. This is Republicans and Democrats standing shoulder to shoulder and saying the exact same thing. Show up and testify or face the legal consequences of defying a congressional subpoena. When Mace, a Republican who has built her brand on conservative credentials, aligns with Garcia, a Democrat who has built her career on holding this administration accountable, you're witnessing something that transcends normal political calculations. You're seeing the emergence of an institutional coalition that prioritizes congressional authority over partisan loyalty. The Republican defection dimension is the element that should terrify anyone still defending this administration, because it represents the complete collapse of the partisan firewall. For years, the defense against every accusation followed a predictable pattern. Democrats say something damaging, Republicans dismiss it as politically motivated, and the public remains divided along partisan lines. But when Nancy Mace formally writes that Bondi handled the Epstein files terribly and undermined President Trump, she's not providing material for Democratic attack ads. She's creating a Republican-sourced accountability record that cannot be dismissed as partisan fiction. The words "handled terribly" and "undermined" appearing in an official congressional letter from a Republican representative fundamentally alters the evidentiary landscape. Democrats can now point to this letter and say, even Republicans acknowledge, without exaggeration or spin. They can quote a Republican colleague verbatim and let those words do the political damage that Democratic accusations never could. The DOJ secrets exposure dimension addresses the substantive heart of this entire controversy. What exactly happened with those Epstein files? Why did the release process appear designed to protect certain individuals while exposing victims? The subpoena specifically targets Bondi's potential mismanagement of Epstein releases and the allegation that co-conspirators received protection while victims received exposure. This isn't abstract constitutional debate. This is about specific decisions made by specific individuals that produce specific outcomes that a bipartisan congressional committee has determined warrant investigation. The deposition requirement means Bondi will have to answer questions under oath, with legal counsel present, in a setting where perjury carries genuine consequences. Every answer becomes part of an official record. Every evasion creates a documented pattern. Every contradiction with previous statements becomes potential evidence of obstruction. The Trump reaction dimension reveals more about the president's political vulnerability than any poll ever could. His Truth Social tirade defending Bondi while signaling panic as the GOP turns on the pair represents the kind of public unraveling that political professionals recognize as a definitive indicator of genuine trouble. When a president feels compelled to publicly defend a fired official against attacks from his own party, he's not engaging in strategic communication, he's engaging in damage control that has already failed. The contradiction between his fantastic assessment of Bondi's congressional performance and Mace's formal determination that Bondi undermined him creates a credibility gap that no amount of social media posting can bridge. One of these assessments is wrong. Either Bondi was fantastic and didn't undermine the president, or she handled things terribly and did undermine him. The fact that a Republican congresswoman's formal assessment directly contradicts the president's public praise means someone's relationship with reality has become dangerously attenuated. The Melania dimension, and this is where the story acquires its most human and therefore most devastating element, adds a layer of personal drama that transforms political scandal into something approaching Shakespearean tragedy. When the former First Lady speaks out, she's not just commenting on political developments, she's providing insight into the private conversations happening inside the residence, inside the family, inside the inner circle where political spin cannot penetrate. Whatever she says, however she frames it, the mere fact of her public engagement on this issue signals that the normal boundaries between public performance and private reality have completely collapsed. First ladies typically maintain strategic silence during political crises. They protect the family brand by refusing to engage with controversy. When that silence breaks, when the protective barrier dissolves, you're witnessing the final stage of political unraveling. Let me paint the full picture of what this convergence actually means for the institutional accountability landscape. The House Oversight Committee has demonstrated that it will enforce subpoenas against former officials regardless of Department of Justice obstruction. The bipartisan nature of the contempt threat means no one can credibly claim this is a partisan exercise. The Republican defection documented in an official congressional letter provides permanent evidentiary support for every future investigation. The personal nature of the subpoena eliminates the former official escape route that previous administrations have exploited. The specific focus on Epstein file handling connects this controversy to the most politically radioactive subject matter imaginable, and the presidential panic visible in public communications confirms that the White House understands exactly how vulnerable they've become. What happens next follows a trajectory that has become depressingly familiar in these situations. Bondi will likely attempt to delay, citing various procedural objections. Her legal team will file motions challenging the scope of the subpoena or the committee's authority to compel personal testimony. The Department of Justice, despite no longer employing her, may intervene with institutional arguments about separation of powers. But the committee has already demonstrated its willingness to pursue contempt charges, and with bipartisan support for enforcement, the usual political protections simply don't apply. Eventually, whether through voluntary compliance or court-ordered testimony, Bondi will sit in that chair, raise her right hand, and face questions that have no good answers. The questions will be devastating in their simplicity. Who made the decisions about which Epstein files to release and which to withhold? What criteria determined whose names appeared and whose remained redacted? Who was consulted during the review process? Were any communications with the White House relevant to these decisions? Did anyone outside the Department of Justice influence the release strategy? Each answer will create new questions. Each evasion will prompt follow-up demands. Each contradiction with documentary evidence will become potential perjury exposure. And throughout this entire process, Nancy Mace's letter will sit in the congressional record like a ticking clock, reminding everyone that a Republican has already formally determined that Bondi handled things terribly and undermined the president. The political implications for the 2026 midterms are impossible to overstate. Republicans running for re-election will face questions about this letter. They'll be asked whether they agree with Mace's assessment. They'll have to explain why a member of their own conference felt compelled to formally document concerns about the Attorney General's handling of Epstein files. Every Democratic challenger will incorporate Mace's words into campaign materials. Even Republicans acknowledge will become the most damaging phrase in American politics. And Trump, forced to defend a fired attorney general against attacks from his own party, will find that his usual tactics simply don't work when the accuser shares his partisan affiliation. The Epstein dimension ensures this story never fades from public consciousness. Every development will generate renewed interest in the underlying files. Every hearing will produce new demands for full transparency. Every deposition will reveal new details about who knew what and when they knew it. The subject matter itself creates an engagement dynamic that no amount of strategic distraction can overcome. People want to know what happened. People want to understand who was protected and why. And a congressional investigation with bipartisan support and Republican defection documentation provides the most credible possible mechanism for obtaining those answers. The presidential vulnerability exposed by this entire episode extends far beyond the immediate controversy. When a president's own party formally documents that his attorney general undermined him, the perception of political competence collapses. Every future appointment will face enhanced scrutiny. Every policy initiative will encounter heightened skepticism. Every public statement will be measured against the documented record of internal dysfunction. The presidency itself, as an institution, relies on the perception of competent management. When that perception shatters, when the documentary evidence demonstrates that the chief executive cannot even maintain loyalty among his own appointees, the capacity to govern effectively diminishes with each passing day. What makes this particular accountability convergence uniquely dangerous for the Trump political operation is the documentation. Nothing in this story relies on anonymous sources or leaked communications. Every element exists in formal, citable, permanent form. Mace's letter is an official congressional document. The subpoena is a legally enforceable instrument. The bipartisan contempt demand is part of the committee's official record. The DOJ's no longer AG claim and the committee's personal binding response are both documented positions. Even Trump's Truth Social communications exist in a format that cannot be denied or retracted. This evidentiary completeness eliminates every traditional defense mechanism. There's no fake news allegation that can erase an official congressional letter. There's no deep state conspiracy theory that can explain away a Republican representative's formal determination. There's no alternative narrative that can survive contact with documentary evidence that all parties acknowledge exists. The institutional stakes extend beyond this particular controversy. Every future congressional investigation will cite this precedent. Every future subpoena to a former official will reference this personal binding determination. Every future claim of executive privilege will confront the documentary record of what happened when those claims were tested against bipartisan oversight demands. The Bondi situation establishes new norms for congressional accountability that will constrain every administration regardless of party. That's the institutional consequence of allowing a controversy to reach this level of formal documentation. The human dimension, and this is where Melania's voice enters the narrative with devastating effect, transforms political analysis into something more immediate and relatable. Whatever she says, however she frames her intervention, the mere fact of her public engagement signals that the carefully constructed boundaries between political performance and personal reality have dissolved. First, families maintain strategic silence because silence preserves options. Silence allows future narrative construction. Silence protects the brand by refusing to validate any particular interpretation of events. When that silence ends, when the protective membrane ruptures, you're witnessing the final acknowledgement that normal political management has failed and only personal truth remains. The Republican fracture documented in Mace's letter represents something more fundamental than a single member's defection. It signals the emergence of survival calculations that transcend partisan loyalty. When a Republican representative determines that formally criticizing a Trump appointee serves her political interests better than defending the administration, she's making a calculation about where the political winds are blowing. She's betting that being on the right side of Epstein file accountability matters more to her constituents than being on the right side of Trump loyalty. And if one Republican is making that calculation publicly, dozens more are making it privately. The formal letter is just the visible tip of an iceberg of private concerns that will eventually surface through additional defections, additional documentation, and additional demands for accountability. The deposition itself, whenever it occurs, will create new documentary evidence that compounds the existing record. Every answer under oath becomes potential impeachment material. Every contradiction with previous statements becomes potential perjury referral. Every admission about decision-making processes becomes grist for additional investigations. The subpoena doesn't just compel testimony, it creates a permanent evidentiary foundation for every subsequent accountability mechanism. And because the subpoena binds personally rather than officially, none of this evidence can be suppressed through institutional privilege claims. The public perception dimension matters enormously for understanding why this particular controversy resists the usual deflection strategies. Epstein file handling occupies a unique position in public consciousness. Unlike abstract policy debates or procedural disputes, the question of who was protected and why engages fundamental notions of justice and accountability. People across the political spectrum share a visceral reaction to suggestions that powerful individuals received special treatment in a case involving systematic abuse. When a congressional investigation with bipartisan support targets those suggestions, public attention locks in and refuses to release. No amount of alternative programming or strategic distraction can compete with the fundamental human desire to see accountability applied equally. The Trump screams referenced in the title capture something essential about the emotional reality underlying this entire situation. The president understands, perhaps more clearly than anyone, what formal Republican defection means for his political future. He understands that Mace's letter cannot be erased, cannot be denied, cannot be reframed. It exists as permanent documentary evidence that a member of his own party, someone whose political identity was forged in loyalty to him, determined that his attorney general handled the Epstein files terribly and undermined him. Every time he sees that language quoted in news coverage, every time he hears it referenced in congressional hearings, every time it appears in campaign advertisements, he experiences the unique agony of being wounded by a weapon forged in his own political workshop. The accountability architecture now in place ensures that this story will continue developing regardless of any individual's preferences or strategic communications. The subpoena creates legal obligations. The bipartisan contempt threat creates enforcement mechanisms. The documentary record creates evidentiary foundations. The public attention creates political consequences. And the Republican defection eliminates the partisan defense that has protected this administration through every previous crisis. When all these elements converge, when every escape route is systematically closed, when every traditional defense mechanism is rendered inoperative, you're witnessing something that American politics rarely produces: genuine, unavoidable, institutionally enforced accountability. The days ahead will reveal whether Bondi complies voluntarily or forces contempt proceedings. They'll reveal whether additional Republicans join Mace in formal criticism. They'll reveal what Melania's public intervention specifically entails. But regardless of these tactical developments, the strategic reality has already been established. A Republican congresswoman has formally documented that the president's attorney general handled the Epstein files terribly and undermined the president. That documentary record will survive every news cycle, every press conference, every social media post. It will be cited in history books. It will appear in legal filings. It will shape public understanding of this administration long after every participant has left the political stage. And that, more than any temporary controversy or fleeting scandal, is what makes this moment genuinely devastating. Not the immediate political damage, but the permanent documentary wound that no amount of spin can heal. The convergence of these elements, personal subpoena, bipartisan contempt threat, Republican defection letter, DOJ secrets exposure, presidential panic, and First Lady intervention, creates a political perfect storm that transforms what could have been another transient controversy into an enduring accountability milestone. Future generations studying this period will find Mace's letter in the congressional record and understand, with the clarity that only documentary evidence provides, that even the president's own party recognized the fundamental failure at the heart of this episode. They'll see the subpoena enforcement mechanisms and understand that Congress retained its institutional authority even when executive branch officials attempted to evade scrutiny. They'll note the bipartisan nature of the accountability demands and understand that some principles transcend partisan division. What emerges from this convergence is something genuinely rare in contemporary American politics, a moment when institutional processes function exactly as designed, when documentary evidence overwhelms narrative spin, when partisan loyalty yields to accountability demands, and when the public receives genuine insight into how power actually operates. The Bondi Congress Epstein fiasco will be studied not because it's unique, but because it's exemplary. It demonstrates what happens when congressional oversight functions properly, when members prioritize institutional authority over partisan convenience, and when documentary evidence creates accountability that no amount of political manipulation can escape. And at the center of it all sits one sentence in one letter from one Republican representative: handled the Epstein files terribly and undermined President Trump. 11 words that changed everything. 11 words that cannot be unwritten. 11 words that will echo through every future investigation, every future hearing, every future attempt to understand what happened inside the Department of Justice during this administration. The president can scream into the void of social media. He can deploy every rhetorical defense in his considerable arsenal. He can attack the messenger, deny the message, and attempt to change the subject. But those 11 words remain, permanent and damning, in the official congressional record. And in the end, documentary evidence always wins.